I think that set up an unrealistic expectation as to what
Robodebt was oversold from the beginning.
Oh, it was totally oversold, Commissioner.
Welcome to the Westminster tradition, where we are unpacking lessons for the public service, starting with the Robodebt Royal Commission. Today we're going to learn about where Robodebt came from. Whose bright idea was it? Far from a Machiavellian scheme of evil ministers, Robodebt was always a creature of the public service, created by, implemented by, protected by, and ultimately only barely ended by the public service. So this episode is about what happens when you have a bright idea that goes on to take its own momentum. So I'm here today with Danielle Elston, recovering public servant. Hi, Danielle.
Hello, Alison.
And Caroline Crozer-Barlow, currently a senior public servant in the South Australian Public Service. Hey, Caroline.
Hey, Alison.
So, have either of you ever had an idea that you thought was awesome, but it wasn't?
Oh, like 700, haven't you, Dee?
Look, I can be a bit of an ideas factory, which requires, management.
That's right. I think when I think about this one, the one that really sticks in my head, and it wasn't actually my idea, but I was a pretty enthusiastic promulgator of it, was I used to work in a poor agency where we were always looking for opportunities to get revenue from other people's customers or other people's clients. And we once had a really great budget measure where we thought, yep, we'll go and cover some money from someone else's licence fee. And we got it all the way to the state budget process, and before we bothered telling the other agency about it. And I remember sitting down with them and they just said to me, look, just so you know, to change the IT system to be able to recover that fee will cost more than the amount of money that you are seeking to recover. And that was really disappointing. So, yeah, I've had some of those.
That's interesting, Caroline, because mine have been, I worked in a very poor agency as well, a very poor kind of regulatory agency, and a lot of the acts were 30 or 40 years old that hadn't been reviewed or looked at, and I spent a little while being a complete ideas factory of simplification and reform, and every time came up against the fact that the ICT systems, in government, particularly in state government, we regulate everything. We regulate hairdressers, we regulate where you can fish, we regulate, and all for good reason, to protect various kind of things and promote other things. But what it does mean is often, and particularly in a little state like South Australia, the cohort of customers is tiny and ICT changes are incredibly expensive. And so I lost like a year, I think, putting up 50 different changes at a time, all of which were, I don't know if awesome is quite right, Alison, but they were good. And then being felled every time by the fact that to do it would cost and be harder than to leave the clunky existing system.
Yeah. And
had to learn to pick a big chunky change and go after that, and the more customers, the better, which I think does happen here with Robodebt and Centrelink, which is scale. So there was enough customers to invest the money, to build the thing. Whereas all of my awesome ideas have been for the benefit of 9 different people, and the ICT change was, X amount of whatever. So
I think that's a really good segue then into where did this bright idea of Robodebt come from, and what was the kind of the background, the behind the scenes of the operating environment in social security. Caroline, take us through how Robodebt as a concept was formed.
Yeah, so Robodebt is the idea of the compliance division in the Department of Human Services. And the compliance division is never a sexy area of a department, always worth saying. And it's clear when you hear the people give testimony before the Royal Commission that this compliance division was particularly not a sexy area of DHS. They were, however, kind of popular with ministers because they were the place where you might come to find savings. They were a target-rich environment in a tough budget context because it was where you would go to say, oh, well, we're going to increase our compliance activity and make X billion dollars amount of revenue.
Yeah, if you're committed to no new taxes, what
Gotta
you
come
can
from
do
somewhere.
go harder on collecting the ones that you've got.
Said that. So we've got this compliance division. They're a place where you come for savings. They're also, of course, like held together by sticky tape and rubber bands. So the kind of thing Danielle was just talking about in terms of the IT system, clearly their IT system is terrible. They've got they're a national team, so they've got people all across Australia, all of them operating according to different standard operating procedures, none of them operating in a consistent way. At some point, one of the people says the most expert person in compliance was a guy called, I think, Jamil, who was an APS 6 up in Brisbane. So this is kind of a cottage industry. So there they are. They're doing this, and then there's a series of natural disasters. A whole bunch of people from compliance get posted out to do payments for natural disasters, so they get even further behind on their workload. So they're behind, they're not terribly professional, and they're really siloed from the rest of the agency. It doesn't feel like an amazing environment to work in at that point in time.
So have you ever worked in one of those unloved areas, those kind of held together by sticky tape and rubber bands?
Oh, yes. I mean, I had the incredible fortune in my time in the state government to spend the vast majority of it in also quite poor parts of the department. Again, we're back to scale. Like the investment in agencies often comes down to how big you are, and the bigger you are, the more you can move resources around, I think, to meet emerging needs. But what I was thinking as you were talking, Caroline, is it really makes me think, what state does a team have to be in to do reform? So if you are coming off a base of a team where, as you know, there's one guy in Brisbane who seems to know what he's doing and the rest of us are just doing our very best, should that be the first warning sign to go, we are not in a position to scale up change? Like, is this a question of what does your function and team have to look like? And the reality is, when I'm thinking about that, is often being a broken function or a not functioning well function is where you are then under pressure to improve and do a big reform. And so there's an inverse, like there's a proper kind of inverse problem there, which is we ask the people and the teams or the units with the least capacity to scale up the biggest change.
And I think as well there's like an assumption that, like an unwillingness to invest up front in IT systems, and then an assumption that it should just be able to do the thing you want it to be able to do now with no additional investment. So I've certainly worked with an IT system that was held together with string and rubber bands, and trying to get the sort of authorising environment for the reform, in this case secretaries and ministers, to understand that their excellent idea just wasn't going to be able, like, we might break this entire IT system by trying to implement this. And so what we had to do was like stagger the people that could join the system, which meant I had people that were just going like absolutely feral because they wanted to sign up. And I was like, we're not taking sign-ups from your sector at this time.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. I mean, Danielle, thinking about your question about is a team ready for reform? Like, I think one of the things that's really interesting in the Robodebt genesis is from this place where things are really bad, they, in the centre in Canberra, they try and build a reform team, right? Like, so they get in some smart buds and they're like, yeah, we've got some good ideas and, you know, we're trying to modernise and we're trying to build this modernisation.
They've put together this team that's committed to reform. What is the idea that they come up with that they think is going to save them?
So what they have access to is a bunch of ATO data, your PAYG data that says, you know, Alison Lloyd Wright earned X thousand dollars in 2010, 2011. And they can compare that to what Alison Lloyd Wright declared to Centrelink in 2010, 2011. And they can say, if those numbers are different, then Alison Lloyd Wright probably lied to us and owes us some money. Or maybe she didn't lie to us. Maybe she just forgot and, you know.
Made a mistake. Honest mistake.
Made a mistake. Honest mistake. And actually, this idea comes up in part because they're worried about people accruing bigger and bigger debts. It's taking them so long to get to compliance activities because their people have been off doing natural disasters that they're like, oh, by the time we get there, they've been accruing debts for 4 or 5 years. So it's terrible. You know, we really should tell them earlier.
So in putting these ideas together, were they like, this is the amount of the discrepancy, or is there like, there's just potential here, right? We don't know exactly what it is. We could work it out. But this is a great way to start that conversation with our client base. And potentially, if even some of this debt is real, boom.
Yeah, I think much more the latter as they start this conversation. They're much more like, look, we know often these things are resolved when we follow up with the clients, but we know there's also a discrepancy. And we know that at the moment we deal with 1% of the cases that are flagged as discrepancy. And in those 1% of the cases, most of them, it turns out, is like a problem. Someone has been telling us a fib. Because, of course, they take the highest discrepancy cases to do the 1% of compliance actions they're already doing.
But Caroline, who are these people? And so we're talking about these people. So this is an enormous system. So they're the compliance area. And so I suppose perhaps for people less across it, these are not the people who are on the phone talking to you about your income each week. These are not Centrelink workers. They're policy wonks.
So there's a distributed team of Centrelink workers, like people sitting in regional offices who are the ones who go and do the work. But this idea is someone sitting in Canberra looking at the different numbers and thinking about it. So there's an interesting dynamic.
Did they ever ask Jamil in Brisbane? Or any of these like distributed regional offices about the brilliance of this idea?
They do, and it turns out that some of the regional offices have real problems with the idea when it gets into implementation.
So then they've got this bright idea. How does it become like a real active live policy?
So they're like, oh, well, budget proposal time. Maybe we'll go chat to DSS, who are the policy agency, about putting up a budget bid, right? And by budget bid, they mean a revenue measure, so an increase in compliance, so they get lots of money, but also some expenditure on the side, getting that ICT system that will enable the customer to interface with compliance and let them know, oh, my income is X or Y. So they go off and talk to DSS. DSS are like, it's good if you're telling people about future stuff, but we're not convinced that you can ask them about their past stuff. And that is the beginning of Robodebt. Now, at the same time as they're having these conversations, a couple of critical things happen. Firstly, they get a new DepSec. They get a DepSec who doesn't know the division very well, but she's been put in charge by the secretary because she's a can-do kind of lady. So this is Melissa Golightly. And then they get a new minister. They get Minister Scott Morrison, who is very keen on being a tough welfare cop on the beat.
And so this thing has very little work so far, but we're already seeing it escalating. And so it's the bright idea by the Canberra compliance folks. Jamil in Brisbane hasn't been kind of brought in for that technical operational idea. No one's really sure what's required. It's a challenging budget bid, right? So for regular punters, when you see a budget, you see expenditure, you see schools going up, you see bridges and roads. What you don't see is the restructuring of government money, which is money in, money out, money for ICT systems. I'm looking forward to the day when the ICT people find a way to cut a ribbon on an ICT system to elevate investment in ICT, because there is no community consent for spending more money on government ICT. And so we don't do it very often. And so there's not been huge amounts of work here, Caroline, from what you're saying, and yet it's somehow off on the fly already, and even process. With early hairs on it, they already feel committed to it, completely committed to it.
Yeah, and it lines up with like a ministerial ambition. So it's got a kind of political authorising environment. It's got your local authorising environment, a new DepSec who wants to show that she's a can-do lady, and you're away before you know it.
I think one of the things that's so interesting about that away before you know it is So the DepSec sort of takes it and runs, right? And she just hears $1.2 billion. Like, it's clear she's got dollar signs in her eyes.
Yeah,
And
free
the
money.
compliance, yeah.
How often do you get that in government? Never.
Well, yeah. The compliance team are, like, yeah, free money, but also like we'd need lots of people to administer the system and we'd need lots of money to do the ICT system. So, they're they haven't done their due diligence on whether they're going to be able to recover all that money, but they are, writing up kind of a scope of what this giant project might look like. And in classic budget process, and we'll talk about this more in future episodes, as it goes through, what gets cut from the budget bid? What do you think gets cut from the budget bid, ladies?
The extra people. Did I win?
Bingo! So instead of getting a whole bunch of extra people to administer this compliance activity, they are told to do it not within existing resources, but I think it was like a very low number of FTE over the top of what they were intended to do, which of course means that then when we get to implementation, they have to rely even more on the IT system, right? Because they want to pick up the phone and talk to all these clients that they're suddenly sending all these letters to. So baked in from the very beginning was that underfunding of this giant reform effort that was half-baked and half thought of in the first instance. It was always set up to fail.
And so I think there's two things there, right? There's one that, so what's so unusual about this is it's a government department saying we're going to make you, government, more money, but you're not allowed to just harvest it into revenue. We're actually going to spend that money inside ourselves. So there's this kind of incentive that might not otherwise tend to exist. Yeah. And I guess the other thing here as well is, so you take a kind of, reasonably well conceived insofar as like it has logic to it, proposal into the budget process. Before you know it, it's approved minus the additional resources that you said you needed. And then I think one of the next stages of that is, okay, your budget bid got approved, stand it up now.
Right now.
Right,
So true.
It's
so
in the budget.
true.
There's a line there. It says we're going to do this thing. I expect to see it up and operational within 3 months. And so I think in future episodes we'll talk about that kind of transition then from it being a successful budget bid to a stood-up program with maybe not as much investment at the front end in terms of time and thinking as maybe warranted. But how often is that the case, that we're committed to a good idea, which means we do it now?
Yeah, I think I once worked for a chief executive who said to Treasury at one point, at a critical point in the budget submission process, look, if you're going to make us do it this way, I'm withdrawing the budget bid because we won't be able to deliver it. It's not going to achieve the thing that we want to deliver it. Like, I'm fine. I'll just pull it out. And as it happened, that was sufficient to get the budget bid through unscathed. But I just have an enormous amount of respect for that, because it took a lot of gumption to sort of say out loud, I can't deliver it in the way that you are asking us to deliver it. And it is better that we don't pretend we can deliver it than that we get the money, a little bit of money, and we pretend, and then everyone's disappointed in 5 years' time because we haven't got the outcomes. So I found that a very impressive act of leadership at the time. And I wondered if it was in part made possible by that chief executive having a pretty good sense of what implementation on the ground looks like. So one of the things that really strikes me in this case is that the DepSec is new in, and she just has no bloody idea about like what this looks like, right? She doesn't understand what compliance in Centrelink looks like. She has no imagination or scale of it. And so I just think it like literally never occurred to her that cutting 700 FTE when you're going to be sending out 100,000 letters every month was probably a bad idea, because you wouldn't have enough people to answer the phone.
And so I take your point, Caroline, but also that does seem quite obvious. In that sense of, if I'm going to send out 100,000 letters, like, I feel like it does also go back to that staying in the top end and never getting into the crunchy. Like, it must have been there that you were sending out X 100,000 letters.
So you've got this new DepSec. Maybe she's not down in that level of detail. But you've got a new minister as well, and both of them are trying to be impressive. And I think that creates almost the perfect storm for a bright idea like this to take on a form that kind of no one ever intended. Or maybe they did intend it, but it sort of got away from them at some point, is really my feeling here.
I think there's also something about some people, some chief executives, some secretaries might promise to do a thing for less, knowing that they will come back and ask for more later. And I never want to impugn, never seen anyone do that in a budget process, right? But I do think that there's something in this context as well. So it was like, if we can just get it up, then we can work it through.
Yeah.
Because actually, what did they want from this bid? The team wanted a new ICT system and, people to kind of not get us behind on their debts. So that's nice of the team. What did the DepSec and the minister want from this bid? They wanted $1.8 billion of revenue in the forward estimates so they could claim a budget surplus. Like, it's that simple, right? And so it sort of didn't matter how achievable or not it was for the purpose of writing the thing on the piece of paper. And as it happened, they ended up putting so many FTE on this project over the life of the project, right? Well more than the 700 or whatever it was that was cut in the beginning, because they started needing to flood it with resources. So it cost them a fortune to administer.
And so in this episode, I guess, we've canvassed how Robodebt went from, like, someone's thought bubble into a fully funded, ready-to-implement proposal. What do we learn from this, I guess, as public servants or reformed public servants about that kind of ideas generation process?
I mean, what I hope we don't learn is to stop being ambitious and kind of thinking about things, right? Like, I think you can learn the wrong lesson, which is you have to fully work every idea up before you upload it with a DepSec because it might get taken and do a thing. Like, I think that's the wrong lesson. For me, I think what I learned from it is the importance of gumption in your middle management along the way to go back and say, this isn't enough, or this isn't going to work, or we still need to keep working things through. Like, you have to, as a middle manager, be really confident in your ability to hold the integrity of the thing you're proposing true. And if you're not able to do that, then you probably shouldn't be floating these ideas.
And I don't think we want to learn the bit where we don't do anything because we're so prone with insecurity about developing a poor system that we hold it all in until it's perfect. I do think there's probably quick models, though, of connecting the bright idea with the operational, that where you can stress test things much more quickly. Like, we'll get to Colleen later, but I really feel like if Colleen had been asked for 5 minutes, we could have very quickly sifted through some of the things. So you don't have to be in the granular detail, but you do have to know enough people who are managers, not just FASs and directors and executive directors, to test ideas with them before you float. So you don't have to have done the modelling. And I hear what you're saying, Caroline. We don't want to get to the point where it takes 10 years to have every idea because we've done so much work on it. But we do want to be, before we get to this point that they got to, be close enough to the action that anything very obvious floats up much more quickly.
Any final thoughts from things that this episode has prompted us to think about for our listeners?
For me, Alison, just the thought that everything seems shiny and possible at the beginning, like that there's always this kind of optimism through which people view their work as public servants. Like, these guys thought they were doing a good thing, they were going to help people have a better customer experience, they were going to fund it through a kind of clever self-funding mechanism, and that feeling of optimism and purpose is probably a useful feeling that we want to harness. I just don't quite know how to harness it safely.
Yeah, and for me it is that tension. We do not want to be devoid of ideas. We do not want to not be able to do things quickly. We do not want, the public service is often accused of being really slow, but quite frankly, when we go fast, like there might be...
Sometimes the wheels come off the train.
Sometimes the wheels come off the train. And so it's more a reflection of getting the tenor of the speed of how we do things right. And I'm not sure I have an answer for it, but I certainly know that where this is going with Robodebt is not how one goes about it, in the sense of just keeping on going regardless, when even at this point there are starting to be early hairs on this that everyone is already throwing to the side. They're already just continuing to move on, knowing they're starting to hear their own alarm bells.
And so for me, I think there's something around the kind of career progression, right, at senior levels, new minister, but junior minister who wants to be a big deal. And P.S. he gets to become one. Spoiler alert. Spoiler alert. A new DepSec who's, on the up and up as well. And so how you kind of, I guess, the inherent tension between I want to serve my minister, which is our responsibility, I want to do the best I can, I want to be impressive, against I need to reach further back down into the organisation, recognise that people much less senior than me might actually have much more knowledge on this than me, empower them to tell me that it's wrong or needs work, and be frank and fearless even where that might be career limiting or might stop you from looking immediately impressive to your new minister who also wants to look.
I just, Alison, just to riff just slightly on that for a second, there's something really hard about that as the new DepSec if you completely don't respect the division that you're leading. So that's the foundational part of this, is that I think no one had any particular respect for the professionalism or competency for the team that came up with this idea. They just liked the dollar signs.
Such a strong point.
Till next time.
Till next time.
This podcast was recorded on Kaurna land, and we recognise Kaurna elders past and present. Always was, always will be. Hey, this is one of our early recordings. We're still getting it together, and I had COVID, so stick with us. Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. Those of us in the employ of the state government speak in a strictly personal capacity, consistent with the Public Sector Code of Ethics that permits public servants to promote an outcome in relation to an issue of public interest, in this case, the betterment of the public service. Nothing we say should be taken as representing the views of the government or our employers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. If you want rigorous reporting on Robodebt, we recommend the work of Rick Morton at the Saturday paper, Chris Nouse and Luc Henrique Gomez at the Guardian, Ben Eltham at Crikey, and of course, the Robodebt Royal Commission itself. The first 8 episodes were recorded before the Royal Commission launched its final report, and so don't benefit from the great wisdom of Commissioner Holmes. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.